First of all, I'd like to gain your views and impressions on some of the themes and issues from the film. But I'd like to start with you, Kavita. We recently screened a documentary film called Cities of Sleep as part of the London Asian Film Festival. Now, this film reveals the presence of a vast underclass in Delhi who don't have access to a place to sleep. Some of these people sleep on bridge girders, sandwiched between the roadway above and murky waters of the river below, so literally in between life above and death below. I'm also thinking about, several impoverished men from the rural hinterlands of India who are then forced to migrate to Delhi in order to find jobs. And they inevitably land up living squalid lives in slums in Delhi. I wondered if you could comment on the push-pull of rural to urban migration. And in the context of the film, some of the perpetrators lived in slums. So would you be able to comment on those factors as causal agents?
Yes. I think maybe just stepping back from those questions just for a minute. Ashvin sent me the link for this film a few weeks ago, and I kept putting off watching it. And I finally made myself watch it last week and stopped, and then started again and stopped. So it's been quite a difficult film to watch, and so it's been this evening's been quite difficult, so watching it from start to finish. And I thought it was a very courageous film, and I thought it was a very powerful film. Courageous, I think, because it was made, I think time gives you a sense of perspective, and I think this has come quite close to the act, and therefore our willingness to listen or to think or to sort of even try and think that there's a different side to this, or that we need to unpack the stories of the men. I think that's, in terms of not giving us enough time, or the fact that it's been produced this early, that's quite a courageous act. And in terms of sort of trying to think then through these men's lives, I thought it was very powerful also because it does lots of things. And I'm not a film critic or anything, but just in terms of kind of the way that it's made like a documentary, the way that it is, the way that it portrays violence as very everyday and very mundane and very public. I mean, that's what I find really unsettling, because if violence is exceptional, then you can somehow sort of discount it. But if it is everyday and if it is around you, the fact that a lot of this violence, at least the way that it's filmed in the way that it's portrayed, happens during the day, happens in sight and within earshot of other people, makes it profoundly kind of unsettling, I thought. So I thought it was really, really powerful in many ways. But in terms, coming back to Ashwin's questions, one of the things that I did take slight issue with in the film was this kind of vision of the slum as dystopic and as kind of a place in which, and a kind of an equation of poverty and kind of relentless poverty with violence and with the will to do violence. And it made me, as a geographer, think a lot about the kind of texts that were written in the 60s and the 70s about slums as dystopic places, as places that were full of criminals and prostitutes and violence, and therefore the only way to deal with them was to remove them, and sort of that, slum dwellers and the poor had no place in the city. So I found that quite sort of problematic, the fact that all of the relationships are just are also violent. And similarly, I think also sort of looking at migration, that's something that's very evident in the film, that everything is constantly on the move, and the fact that there's nothing fixed, that these are children who move, and as adults they're moving, they don't have fixed jobs, they don't have a fixed residence and all of that. So migration and mobility is quite a powerful theme in the film. And of course, migration is about alienation, migration is about losing one's roots, etc. But I think, again, a very sort of partial view of migration also, because migration also is about networks and things like that. So with those two things, I think I was a little bit less kind of convinced in relation to particularly the portrayal of the slum. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. The idea of a network, and we live in a network society where we're so inextricably intertwined and interconnected via various forms of media. So Amit, coming to you. There seemed to be a clash of two Indias in the film. One that is middle class, aspirational, economically ascendant, and another India which is still rooted in patriarchy, feudal structures, and impoverished. So the perpetrators, to a significant extent, are detached, they're disenfranchised, they're the social detritus, marginalized on social, cultural, political levels. So in the ascendant narrative of a technologically advancing India, where would you locate the perpetrators?
I also want to echo what Kavita has just said in terms of the film's positioning of the perpetrators. And again, we can say immediately, to explain is not to excuse. To explain the agency of these men, to understand their specific history, is of course not to excuse them from what they did. But part of what the film does is situate each of these perpetrators, each of these rapists, in terms of what I would call a kind of media landscape. They're after phones. They want phones. They're taking selfies. They're documenting a otherwise worthless life, worthless from the point of view of society. To get forms of value, create self-worth through technologies that are clearly fetishized. But these technologies are also now being used in very violent ways, directly violent, but also to manage acts of violence. I work on what is called jugaad culture. Jugaad is working around, to work around obstacles. But you see in many of the activities of these men a kind of attitude of being able to work around. And in many, many contexts, this working around is celebrated as working class agency. But in this context, you can see the kind of deeply troubling, deeply implicitly almost violent aspect of the culture as well. That having been said, I think this film comes out of a deep anger from Deepa Mehta, and it is very close to the events, and so one has to put that into context. But it's a question of how one tells the history of misogynist violence. How do you actually situate its structures, and how do you do it in film? And I think she's done a brilliant job of precisely not humanizing, because if you hear some of her own words on YouTube, for instance, she's not trying to humanize these perpetrators of violence. She's trying to actually confront Indian society with its own complicity in their violence. To me, technology, the mobile ecology, these digital ecologies have exacerbated, heightened these tensions, heightened social tensions. There is no, in my sort of viewing of the film, there's no clear indication that these perpetrators are on the wrong side of the digital divide. They all have access in different ways, differential, of course, different ways they have access to technologies. So the question is, in what way is it deployed? I think if you look at other cases in India and other similar sexual assault cases and how the mobile phone is used, the mobile phone is literally being used as a device of torture. Sometimes physically, but often through its various component features. The phone, the camera being an obvious example. To picturize, to capture, once again, the victim, to turn that victim once again into a kind of digital archive of violence. I think that is very important to consider. I think it's also very important to situate this in terms of specific cultures of pornography, different class and caste cultures of rape, and all of those very different relationships to technology. These are big questions, huge questions I couldn't possibly answer in any comprehensive way in the short moment, but it's important to me to be able to connect the uses of different technology in different rape cultures in India. And I want to say that you cannot reduce this question of rape culture to working class impoverishment. It's a very important, that would be a kind of essentializing of it. Nonetheless, it helps us to situate. This film helps us to situate the different materialities of masculinist violence. I'll leave it at that.
Right. It seems a very complex and tangled skein of propositions. I think that the underlying ethos that Deepa Mehta brings to the film is no one becomes who they are in isolation. In the film, we see a vicious cycle of domestic abuse and the demonization of the girl child, which seems conventionalized, naturalized, serialized. And I wondered, Ravinder, to what extent this ossified notion of the female contributes to the notion of male power and patriarchy in India?
Well, like my fellow panelists, I also just want to say a few things about the film itself before actually responding to that particular question. This is the first film using actors. This particular rape happened 4 years ago. People in the audience may have seen Leslie Edwin's film, India's Daughter. There was a play at South Bank which actually used amateur actresses, maybe, I don't know, but women who had actually directly experienced sexual violence. So we've had kind of other sort of forums, if you like. And India's Daughter was also a powerful film in what it tried to convey. Nirvaya was extremely powerful. When I went to see that at South Bank, there were people who could not actually sit through and watch that. And similarly with this film, I think it's a very difficult to watch film, as Kavita is saying. And as Pushpinder said to me when I first heard about this film, it's an experimental film. 11 actors worked in a workshop, kind of over several days in thinking about, okay, how could we actually try and talk about the biographies of these men from what little we know? Because we don't know a great deal. We know they were migrants. We know they came from very poor family background. We know that they were, if you read the court judgment, that they were actually first-time offenders. Yeah? So we know, and we know about the violence because the prison psychiatrist and Deep Gorville actually talked about that in India's Daughter, the documentary, the BBC documentary. So we know a few things, but here what we're actually seeing is really based on the actor's imagination of the kind of lives of these men. And what Deepa Mehta is trying to do is actually really explore why is it that men rape. So by actually focusing on this one case, which happened 4 years ago, that's what she's trying to actually shine the light on. And I think what we do see is actually these kind of themes of patriarchy, we see themes of misogyny, we see gender role socialization, we see power, dominance, control. All of that is going on in the lives of these men. And we're seeing child sexual abuse as well. But I do have to say that there is just so much evidence to disprove the cycle of abuse theory which exists. So there is a risk, in a sense, that it can leave the audience with the thinking, the impression that, of course, that's what will happen if people are abused themselves as children. And what that does is it kind of presents an overly deterministic view of sexual violence. And it actually does take away, diminishes the agency of the men. That somehow they're not responsible for what happened because the environment is so dire. And kind of this overly deterministic view, as I say. So I think that's an issue. And we do have to understand that the family is a unit of the kind of social structures of society. It's a microcosm. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's influenced by a range of other forces in society. And so people living within that family unit are actually taking messages from elsewhere, whether that is the media, whether that's the education system, whether it's the politicians. And we know that, how Indian politicians are not just Indian politicians and other people kind of, in positions of power, are guilty of perpetuating the kind of thing that we're seeing here in, this, as you say, kind of presenting the slum in this very dystopian fashion. And I think we do have to be careful that this is based on one case. Now, rape is universal, it cuts across social classes. So that's a really important thing for us to understand. And I think Deepa Mehta is obviously, as I say, using this as an anchor. So although she calls the film The Anatomy of Violence, it's actually just looking at one segment of society. It's not actually kind of saying, hey, this happens in all these other spheres as well. So I think that's an important thing for us to really take on board. So it's a fictionalized characterization of what the actors and what Deepa Mehta believes happened. But I think in terms of gender role socialization, you kind of get that in the film, but to some extent it can be seen as almost kind of coming across as a caricature as well. One could I'm not a film critic either, but one could dissect these scenes and frames, and I think it would make some very good kind of analysis by media studies students, as well as criminology, which is what I teach alongside sociology. So I think it would make a very interesting film, a very interesting kind of piece of work actually using this film. So I think it's a brave effort, as Kavita has said, and it's a courageous effort on the part of Deepa Mehta. But I think there are some other questions that we have to pose, and the message that will be taken by those who watch a film like this. Deepa Mehta has herself said that men have come to her and said, oh, you're actually sympathizing with these men. You're kind of showing all this kind of poverty and abuse, but they should be hanged. So and she's saying, oh my God, no, that's not what I meant to do. I didn't mean to actually show them in this sympathetic light. I'm just trying to explore, their lives and kind of trying to explain that, as she said, that, these things don't happen in isolation. You are part and parcel of society. If you talk to members of the Burma Committee who actually were responsible for the changes that were brought about in the law, they'll say how women's activists came to them and said, these men are actually members of our society. We have to own up to what these men did. We don't just shun them as monsters, as people that, who really we can't even begin to understand their act, because it's just so terrible, and all we want to do is just hang them. So where's the learning in that? What are the lessons for us as a society? So I'll just stop there, otherwise I'll carry on. It would be like a 40-minute thing. But I think, all of those kind of things, Deepa Mehta really tries hard to explore in terms of the gender role socialization, as I say, the patriarchy, the misogyny, which is all there. But poverty, the grinding poverty also, is being presented because we know the men came from that kind of a background. And I think those issues are real.
Absolutely. I agree that there are multiple hermeneutics or frames of interpretation that could be applied to this film, which is both similar and different from, you mentioned Yale Farber's play Nirbhaya, and also Leslie Udwin's film India's Daughter. On that note, I'd like you to kind of think about some of the negative reactions and the resistance to self-critical evaluation, because we're looking at cinema as a mirror for ethical evaluation. But Leslie Udwin's film India's Daughter was denied a release, banned in India. So would you be able to comment, and this is a general question, on the reluctance to engage in debate or even self-critical evaluation about the reality of rape and its pervasive presence in Indian society?
With India's Daughter, if we just focus on that, there's a multitude of factors there in terms of that resistance to that film. Women's activists said that, this is kind of white savior mentality being portrayed in here, the kind of the colonial attitude, that this is a problem in India. And Leslie Udwin kind of took that on board because the first broadcast on the BBC didn't have the statistics, the global statistics, but then she put that in when it was shown in New York. And I think Deepa Mehta has obviously kind of heard the criticisms of that, and she, for that reason, actually had those women's actual voices to kind of talk about the universality of rape. So I think with India's Daughter, it was women's activists saying, well, actually, this is, you know, the BBC and this is the West saying, and so there was that resistance to that film. But then you also had civil rights activists who were saying, actually, these men have appealed against the death penalty, so there's a case pending in the Supreme Court, and this is actually subverting the course of justice, this film. And so for that reason, there was this kind of resistance to that film. But then, of course, you got others, kind of, you know, the people who hold on to this kind of very parochial mindset of nationalism, if you like, you know, which is the kind of Hindutva sort of mindset that, you know, which is very anti-West, which is kind of concerned about the image of India being tarnished. So there's all of that kind of going on. And there's a lot there. And you know, it's a film that I've studied quite closely because we, Professor Bilbir Barn at Middlesex University and Franco Raimondi, we actually looked at 250,000 tweets following the showing of this film. Actually, we started collecting tweets a day before the film was shown on the 8th of March because we kind of felt this was going to be a big story, so we started collecting tweets about this. And so the themes that actually come out in the analysis of the movies are really around patriarchy, feminism. They are about the lawyers. People were just outraged by the lawyers' views in that. And of course, the real-life rapist, convict, who, in the same way that Deepa Mehta has used one of the rapists to narrate the film, although it's not the same one in India's Daughter is Mukesh, who is Suresh in this film. But here you see Bittu, who's actually one of the others, actually doing the narration. So I think, you know, as having watched both, I've been kind of trying to see how has Deepa tried to, in a sense, use something different, but you know, try and work with that to try and promote understanding of this area. So I think, in terms of India's Daughter in particular, there has been resistance, but there have been kind of different social actors, if you like, in society, for various different reasons as to why that resistance has been there. And I think, as I said, I mean, I won't repeat what I've already said, you know, in terms of those kinds of reasons, that's why there has been, you know, would the BBC have made a film, for instance, about a case that was pending in court in the UK? Would they have been allowed to do that? I think, so there have been those kinds of issues as well, which I think we do have to really look at.
Right. I think also, but to bring it back to an earlier point that you made in terms of this kind of idea of a new India and an old India, that something like this doesn't chime with that sort of shiny new India image, that kind of the amount of energy and money that is put into sort of brand India, and the new India, which is modern and which is progressive and in which women are doing lots of wonderful things. This goes against that very sort of fundamentally, obviously. So I think it is part of that sort of being very, and I think it's not just that that's something that happens at a state level, that it is something that is very deeply cultural and embedded within the household and community and society, that kind of sense of honor and having a show, you know, for society about, and hiding reality from society. So I think it sort of builds upon that as well. But that it certainly isn't something that Brand India would want to advertise.
On that note, talking about something that's culturally embedded, I wanted about Bollywood's culpability in all of this. I'm referring specifically, and I make mention of this in my book on New Independent Indian Cinema, about the item number. For those of you not aware, an item number is a standalone sexualized song and dance sequence where a female actress is brought in precisely just for that set piece. And they're called item girls. Now, I'm wondering, item numbers have become serialized and conventionalized, almost a celebration of Indian culture. To what extent is this problematic and contribute to some of the systemic malaises relating to rape that we've seen? We see allusion to that in the film as well, where certain Bollywood item numbers are played in the background. So, Amit, would you be able to comment on that?
What can we say about Bollywood and its row in this kind of culture. I do think, and I think in conversation with you and thinking about parallel cinema, thinking about the new cinema in India, I have to say that I think we're living through a kind of golden age of Bollywood cinema. The reason I say that is because at no other time in the history of Bollywood has the Hindi commercial cinema been so heterogeneous. There are all kinds of new genres emerging all the time because of new business models of making films, not in terms of mass release, but in targeted audiences. That's a very important point to say about Bollywood right now. That having been said, I have to agree with Ash as well. The traditional Bollywood song and dance sequence, as well as its mode of address, right? We're talking about commercial cinema that has a mode of address, and that mode of address is a masculinist gaze. And of course, the heterosexual melodrama. Every Bollywood film ends with a wedding. It used to be that way, right? So there is a deep complicity, I think, in Bollywood and in the dominant cinema with these kinds of objectifications and of course, overall kinds of violence against women. Has anyone seen Pink? The movie Pink is a recent Bollywood film, but it's a movie that explicitly thematizes the question of sexual assault in ways that have really surprised people. But of course, it stars Amitabh Bachchan, the big megastar. It's trying to pose these questions in a melodramatic format, and you have to wonder, and you have to sort of appreciate once again Diva Mehta's experimental form, that she's actually trying to tell a history in a way that we would disrupt our habits of viewing. We have habits of viewing in South Asia in terms of cinema, and these habits are disrupted by Diva Mehta's films, which I greatly appreciate, and I think those habits are deeply rooted to a masculinist gaze.
I just say I really like the film Pink.
Yeah.
I watched it recently, and I think it's important for films like that, which are dealing with sexual assault, sexual violence, to reach a mass audience. So I don't have a problem with Amitabh Bachchan playing the lawyer in this case. And what I also really liked about the film was the fact that it actually really tries to address the rape-supporting culture, the rape myths. Because Amitabh Bachchan's really good in the way he's kind of talking about the double standards that exist in society, which measure, we have one yardstick to measure the moral character of a woman and another one to measure the moral character of a man. And he, in the film, actually presents these women as they are. So it's not the ideal victim, it's not the good girl. They're kind of shown as modern, outgoing, they come home late, they're sexual beings. One of them's having an affair with the professor at the local university, and they drink, they smoke, and they go to parties with men. So it's not. It's kind of really saying, look, this is not an invitation to rape because women do this, or they dress like this, or they come home late. And I really like that. So I think that's really important. And I haven't seen a Bollywood film, do that before. It's kind of okay. Talked about the ideal, the good victim, and isn't it awful that this happened, sort of thing. If at all, the previous film has addressed that. And I think what it also is doing, that apart, it's sort of separate from this, which is looking at kind of the lower socioeconomic groups as perpetrators. Pink is actually showing you the well-connected, the affluent sexual offenders. So that's another reason that I really actually quite like that and welcome that, and it's actually reaching a mass audience. So if people haven't seen it, I would recommend that you watch Pink. It's a good film.
But I think also, the item song and the item girl is sort of like, a good example of sort of misogyny and the masculinist gaze and all of that. But if you think about a lot of, and I don't like calling it Bollywood, but in Hindi films, in Hindi films, there's a very long tradition of where a woman saying no doesn't mean no, right? It's just her being coy. It's her just, she really wants to say yes, but she's just saying no. So that kind of, and that has been perpetuated, the kind of myth that when a woman says no, it doesn't mean no. I think that's interesting in itself. So it's a longer tradition. But I think also with the item girl, the thing that sort of gets me sometimes is the extent to which some of the best paid, most popular, and women who are leading the industry are falling over themselves to be an item girl and to do that item song in a film. And what is that about? Is it them internalizing or sort of buying into that whole kind of misogyny, or is it about an affirmation of female sexuality? Because they are very graphic. The songs are graphic, the dresses, the dance, and everything. So I'm a little bit perplexed there when I read that whoever it is wants to do an item song. So and so has been approached to do an item song and is losing weight so that they can do the item song and stuff like that. So that sort of perplexes me a little bit about how to understand it.
That's really interesting, because there's been that change in Hindi cinema over time, over the perhaps last 10, 15, even 20 years. And that, in the past you had Helen, who would do the item number in the 60s and
that
70s.
Was it.
And sort of from the last 10, 15 years, as I say, and as you're pointing out, it's your Rani Mukherjee, or it's whoever,
mainstream,
Ashwarya, right? Who are, and Priyanka Chopra, they are actually wanting to claim that role. So there is something about perhaps modernity and kind of that kind of feminism, if you like, where it's about claiming that and claiming that sexuality. So it's an interesting development.
Yes, I
whether
think
it's right or wrong, or whether it kind of leads or feeds into the masculinity and the misogyny that exists in society is another issue. I mean, I think people will say that Bollywood is really bad and others will say, well, actually, it's just reflecting society. I mean, Honey Singh, for instance, is a Punjabi singer, and his songs were actually put under the microscope when this case happened. Sheila Dikshit, who was the CM at the time, was shown dancing to one of his songs. And in his songs, I mean, there is this criticism that he glorifies rape, sexual violence. He argues that actually I'm just showing this other negative aspect of Indian culture. And so it's an interesting one in terms of whether it's a reflection of society or whether actually it's just influencing the mindset of males.
I couldn't agree more. Yes,
I think one thing, and I agree with what you're saying, Ravinder, is that there's, and this is something that I think Hindi cinema does a lot, it separates out the modern from the feudal. And that distinction seems to be replayed again and again, and that to me is a way of, again, excusing and not understanding in a very serious way.
Thank you. One thing I'd like to highlight is this monumental, almost revolutionary metamorphosis in Indian cinema, where we've seen the emergence of a new wave of independent Indian cinema, or indie cinema as it's being called, where there have been a plethora of films with featuring prominent female roles, both behind the camera and in front. Several films like Angry Indian Goddesses, Parched, Liar's Dice, a lot of the films showcased at the London Asian Film Festivals have a deeply, indie ethos with strong roles for women. So I just wanted to indicate that. One more question before we open the floor to audience questions is the failures and the inadequacies of the powers that be. We see the police, consistently failing in their duties, as well as the legal structures in the rulings of the High Court being particularly ineffectual in coping. So, Ravinder, would you be able to comment on some of the failings of the legal structures and the High Court ruling, as well as the role of the police?
The changes that have been brought about since the Holloway case, one could argue, and Deepa Mehta actually at the end has that sort of statement to say that the number of rapes has actually doubled since 2012. It hasn't actually doubled, so that's incorrect, and maybe somebody should get in touch with Deepa Mehta and say that, because she quotes the NCRB, the National Crime Research Bureau, but maybe she means sexual harassment or sexual assault cases, because if you look at those, they have doubled, but not rape. So the law makes that distinction. I think one of the changes has been that the police have to register an FIR, and I think that could be why we're seeing this increase. Yeah, because otherwise there's they themselves could go to prison for a year unless they do. And I've talked to people who work for the Supreme Court, and they say, I'm saying, but is it really making a difference? You have a piece of law, but is it actually being implemented? But I'm reassured that actually they know of several incidents where the police have had to do that. So I think we might be seeing an increase because of that. The Section 166A, the police have to now actually register an FIR. Where in the past they used to drag their heels, they wouldn't do it. And not only that, we've actually seen new laws that have come into being. So stalking, voyeurism, sexual harassment, for instance, acid attacks and so on. So again, some of the increase could be to do with that, although the rape statistic is wrong in that film. So I think, the criminal justice system is one aspect of society, and it's not necessarily just a law and order problem. The court system, here we need more judges in India, we need more lawyers. The justice system is grindingly slow. It can take years for a conviction or for a case to actually be resolved, and if a conviction is warranted, a conviction to actually for that to happen. So I think the policing system, the courts and so on, changes do need to be made, and they have been made since. And the other important thing actually, so that people don't think actually it's just this one case and the protests that happened that led to these changes. Rape laws were already actually under review before that case happened. And I think people don't actually perhaps appreciate that was already actually in the pipeline. And I think what women's activists would say is that they actually got more than they would have done had that case not actually been highlighted nationally and internationally in the way that it was. And if we hadn't had the protests in that way, in no other country in the world have we had mass protests on that scale for almost 4 weeks. Nowhere about sexual violence. So I think that was a good thing, because it did actually lead to so many more changes. But I think it's kind of broader than just the court system. Court system is obviously important, and policing and all of that. But I think it's also, as I said earlier, you kind of get these people at the top who make really irresponsible statements, or they think they're actually coming from a wise, good place. Just in this country, for instance, last week, we had a judge say that if a woman has been drinking, she's less likely to be believed than one who hasn't been drinking if she is a victim of rape. And so what kind of message does that send? This is a system that's designed to protect. So if you've got a judge actually saying that to a woman, we know that many of the rapes don't even get reported. Yeah. Something like 8 to 9 out of 10. So if a woman who is raped thinks, actually women blame themselves anyway.
Yeah.
But if they've been drinking as well, where is that confidence going to come from to take that to the police and to kind of have that registered and for that to be processed through the criminal justice system?
Thank you. On that note, do we have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you just brought up. Firstly, thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks to the panelists, because I thought the discussion was really interesting, and it brought new light to a really interesting film. I was wondering if the panelists would like to comment on the fact that we're sitting in London, and rape has sort of so far been discussed very much as an Indian problem, and I think we all know that. I think you've mentioned in passing, but what can people over here maybe learn from this film?
As Leslie Udman's film provides us a startling statistic that 1 out of 3 women globally suffer from some form of abuse. So I think, it is a global issue. So Kavita, would you have any thoughts?
I guess it's just, it sounds very, it is that appreciation that violence against women knows no class or caste or national or religious boundaries, that it occurs everywhere in all societies. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. I mean, that's one of the things that I found problematic in this film, was that kind of association of poverty with sexual violence. That sexual violence occurs everywhere in all kinds of guises. So I think that, I guess the takeaway message is that if this happens, that this is about an Indian rape case, but that these kinds of rapes happen in other places as well. And so it's not just an Indian problem, and it's not something that just comes out of an Indian culture or Indian patriarchy or misogyny or a lack of willingness to see complicity or whatever, that happens the world over. It's a global problem. We know that from, so much research done on this. We know that.
Amit, do you have any thoughts?
I think what this film, for me, has done powerfully in the context of India, but it makes me also think about the organizing that happens in places like London. And that has to do, for me, about thinking about the history and culture of complicity. In what way are the cultures that we find normal are complicit with rape culture? Where is the sort of blurring of the line where you can say, oh, there's a clear demarcation between, oh, that is a rapist enunciation, or that's a rapist culture, and the kinds of implicit violences. And I think this is the other thing about an anatomy of violence. The term violence needs a much broader understanding. And this is precisely, I think, what the film does. When you understand your complicity with violence, violence then becomes a generalized condition of misogyny, and also of brutal and relentless and of capital. Capital is also violent, right? That's also the violence that these perpetrators have lived. It's not to excuse them, but it's to understand a general sort of system of violence. And that, to me, is very much involved in thinking about what happens here in the city and the complicities that we have.
Ravinder, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. And I think because as we're saying, rape is a global problem, it's a universal problem. So, the lessons for London or for any other country or for the UK or for anywhere else is that actually this is not dissimilar to what happens in any other context. What's coming through are the kind of issues around patriarchy, masculinity, the kind of normalization of violence, the casualization of violence, and that translates into any other context. And it's also the what we call the rape myths, the victim blaming, that we see in this film. That actually it's the woman. She's as much at fault, if not completely at fault, about what happened. So I think those kind of ideas exist in patriarchal societies across the globe. So it's not that this is somehow although obviously this is about one case, but it's not just some random kind of situation. It's speaking to a universal issue, and that's the important thing.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi. I've got two questions. My first question, we know that India has got this rape culture reputation, but from statistics-wise, do we know per population and the number of assaults, is it much more higher than the rest of the world? And then my second question, I was thinking more about Asians living over here. Do we have a problem within Asians in the UK among misogyny? And I'm guessing kind of most people here are Asian, but born here. And I do think it's quite interesting how still Asians living here are brought up kind of not talking about sex, girls are told to dress modestly, no girl has sex until they get married, and kind of all this funny, it's a bit strange, even though we're born here. And whether you think that's on the same spectrum or whether you think it's separate things, misogyny and this kind of pressure in Indian societies to be modest and not talk about sex.
Thank you. Ravinder, would you like to take the first question?
God, there's lots of questions in that one. That's just one. I'll see what I can recall and perhaps respond to. I think, I wouldn't call myself a criminologist, but I teach criminology because my discipline is sociology. But because I teach criminology undergraduate level, I can speak with some authority and confidence in that, as already has been said, that really 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 rapes don't even get reported. So if you do look at any statistics, any data set is not going to be an accurate reflection. So whether you're looking at statistics in India, UK, US, anywhere, that's not really a true reflection of, is that actually the number of rapes at any given time. In India, the reported number of rapes, and I say reported because we don't know how many actually, in 2012 was around 24,000. The latest statistic is around 34,000, so it's not double in the way that the film reports. And that's just really the tip of the iceberg. Yeah? So we don't know. In, the Leslie Edwin film and others say, a rape happens every 20 minutes or something was the statistic, I think, that Leslie Edwin gave in India's Daughter. If you look at the rape, scholarly literature on rape in the US, you would think that a rape is happening in the US if you came up with some statistic, every few minutes as well. And particularly the problem, and there's a lot of literature on rape on university campuses as well. That research isn't being done in other parts of the world so much, but in the US, there's a lot of research in that area. So, in criminology, we call it the dark figure of crime. So we really only know what happens in terms of reported crime, whether it's rape or any other crime. But there's a huge, this dark figure of crime that we never actually hear about. Yeah. So, and we only know that actually there is more because there are victimization studies, yeah, which are kind of just community samples, yeah, or there are kind of other research studies which are looking at particular crimes. So we know actually that it happens to a greater extent than that which gets reported. Yeah. I think your other question was about Asians in this country. I think you said something about, is it a problem particular problem amongst Asians in this?
Is it wrong to make a link between culturally in Indian cultures, and I'm talking my own experience is just of British Indian cultures because I've never kind of born here, but from what I can see from family friends, that there is this kind of sexism isn't spoken about, and it's just, I was just wondering, I just think it's interesting, is there a link, or actually is it kind of wrong to put a link between that type of cultural behaviour and that obviously misogyny and violent sexual assault that we see in the media?
I think it would be problematic to actually link it to ethnicity and kind of think that actually somehow there is, I mean, for instance, we've had...
Not linking to ethnicity, linking to that...
well, culture, ethnicity would be the same thing. Because I think, for instance, we've had a number of cases of Pakistani men, largely Pakistani men, I should say, who have been convicted of sexual abuse of young women. And a lot of those young women have been women who grew up in the care system. So there's that vulnerability factor there. Now, if we try and kind of somehow just kind of present that as a problem in the Pakistani community, then I think there is a concern there, living in this kind of multicultural society, that we're actually not doing that when those crimes might be happening, say, in the white community. We're not saying, hey, look at that, isn't that terrible that's going on there? That's not to actually excuse or turn a blind eye to anything that's happening, but it's not to make that somehow a causal link, in the same way that I'm saying that childhood sex abuse doesn't make you a sex offender when you're an adult, because it's not a causal relationship. Whether Asians actually are more reluctant to discuss sex matters compared to other ethnicities, I don't know. I couldn't say. I mean, I think sex education even in this country is not taught particularly well, for instance. So I would say that perhaps even white British children, young people, don't actually feel able to sit down and discuss these things. On the whole, some will, and some Asians will as well. But on the whole, I think you wouldn't find that. I mean, sex education is taught in a very mechanical way. You talk to young people, and that's not really what they were seeking. You know, I think it's about what we need to be teaching our youngsters is the emotionality, the emotional value of a relationship. We need to be teaching about sexual consent, which we don't.
Right.
And
On
I think
that note,
we don't do that in a way that we ought to be doing.
on that note, can I ask Kavita and Amit to comment on the British South Asian context? Add to what.
So I think I understood your
Ravinder just
question a
said.
little bit differently. I mean, or two sort of points which might be a little bit tangential. Is research on diaspora populations, which shows that diasporic populations sometimes are much more conservative over a longer period of time than the place that they've left behind. And so in Asian diaspora and lots of sort of particularly middle-class Indians that I speak to will say to you, well, your British Asians are in the dark ages, and, you know, they think that we are still like you when you left, which was 50 years ago, and our values haven't changed or whatever. And that is true in a sense, that if you think about our parents' values, they are the values that were there of a particular place and of a particular generation in the 50s and the 60s. And they've held on to that as something that made them distinct and sort of was about their identity and their culture. So I think that there is this thing about diaspora populations being more conservative, especially around sex and that. And the other point that I was going to make was that also some research, and this is really, I guess, in migration studies, which is about how minority males, and within the context of universities, how minority male students will police the behavior of their female co-nationals, and particularly around international student communities here, that it is it's female students from certain countries find it quite difficult because they're being policed by their sort of their male national students, and it's really their sexual behavior and the fact that they're coming in late or that they're drinking and all of that. So there is some research on that as well. But I did think, I mean, towards the end of this film, just the last point, the end of the film, when he said that, you know, we also want to have girlfriends, and nobody will have us. And I think that is around a repression, around what is, at the end of the day, a very natural thing, a sexual desire, you know, and being able to express your sexuality or to have sex. And I think that does come from a very repressive culture.
Amit, do you have anything to add?
Just very quickly, I grew up in a very conservative South Asian community in California. And it was a community that would do pretty much anything to make sure nothing got out of the community about sexual violence, domestic abuse, rape. And it was largely because I'm very much in resonance with what Kavita has just said. The image of India that the diasporics that I grew up with reproduced was an image of India as pristine, but also as woman, as holy. The woman was holy and at the same time an object of violence. That was a fundamental part of the culture of silence that as a man I grew up in. I think, for me, one of the most important lessons of this film is that men must have feminist support. Men must be supported by feminist structures of being able to express their own feelings, to be in touch with what's going on in their lives. This is something that a fundamental lack of communicating, not being able to communicate, is one of the things that's reproducing what I think is completely a very violent masculinity in the diaspora, as well.
How do you suggest we support these men? Because my reaction is they're such in dark. Some of the men I've come across, you know.
Okay, I don't mean that we should support these men, but no. But I get your point. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's just that, you know, it's hard enough living by yourself and, you know, just looking after yourself without supporting this whole of half the population.
Let me put it this way: how the home is reproduced, how the social relations are reproduced, are about how men and women, boys and girls, feel like they live in different worlds. That, to me, is a disconnect and a kind of gendered apartheid that is very much been my experience in the diaspora, in the South Asian diaspora. But how do we create feminist structures of support for both women and men? That to me is a radical feminist project. It's a project that encompasses the experience of gender as such. And this is, to me, a very important lesson of the film, that men in India and in the diaspora actually think that they're enclosed entities in some ways, that they don't have to express themselves, and they can sort of live their life without having to relate. And that to me is precisely what I mean of not having a support structure and a culture who's not very, very much interested in developing that feminist support structure for men.
Thanks for those cogent and important points. Any other questions? Yes.
Just to finish on a slightly lighter note, do you think that society within India there would be an advantage if 50% of the item numbers in Bollywood films were played by men?
It is actually happening in some movies. You do see, yeah. It is coming.
Yes. Any other questions? Any last questions?
One question, I like how the film questioned a lot of things, even though
If you could just wait for while the mic makes its way to you. There we go.
I really enjoyed how the film questioned you in lots of ways, even though it didn't represent everything that you wanted to see. And one thing that it questioned me about was her friend. I felt he was represented in a way that he wasn't really into her, so that kind of leads on to questions about other classes, etc. And I wonder if you had something to comment on that, because we haven't really heard much about his background. You know, she talks to her family that he's her fiance, but he's always addressed her as a friend. And even the scene where the restaurant and the rooftop, for example, there's that bit where he's not really taking her very seriously. And I haven't really seen that depiction before, and I wonder if you have something to comment on that.
I hadn't really picked up on that. I guess, yeah, no, but when she's on the rooftop and she asks that, have you told your family about me? And he says no, and she says, I have told my family. Yeah. I must admit, I hadn't.
I also wonder if it's emulating the actual real-life case where we didn't hear as much about the male partner as we did about Jyoti Singh.
And he was always just described as a friend,
yes.
And the media was, and I think that was part of the ideal victim image that the media was trying to kind of portray. But I did pick up on that.
Up as well, though?
Yes.
He was
very much so.
I did pick up on that, and I kind of felt that is Deepa Mehta trying to show, to use her real name, Jyoti Singh, or in this case Janki, as kind of perhaps much more liberal, progressive, modern, that she's actually quite happy to tell her family. And there's some sort of, sort of this regressive masculinity here, kind of, where he doesn't, he's not kind of ready for that, or doesn't want to sort of make that commitment. And I wasn't sure whether that's what, she was kind of hinting. And there are other things. That's what I'm saying, that the film could be dissected scene by scene, frame by frame, because I think also the juvenile Ripu, he is punished when the neighbour, the female neighbour, is the one who is actually sexually abusing him. But then at the end, after the rape of Jyoti Singh, of Janki, you see him, in a sense, trying to almost cleanse himself, purify himself of the sin that he feels that he has committed. And even down to sort of tying the rope as well around his head, which is what his father had done. And I know from talking to female friends who are lawyers in Delhi who know people at the NGO that was working with the juvenile, that he actually showed remorse for what had happened. And I don't know if Deepa Mehta picked up on that, because I know she's obviously connected with India and with people in Delhi and elsewhere. But I kind of like that the film actually shows that, because, you know, in criminology there are kind of essentially two models of justice, in the sense that, you know, there is retribution and there is rehabilitation. So in a sense, the film is actually showing, you know, some positivity, some hope that, you know, people can be rehabilitated. And in this case, you know, it's the youngster, it's a 17-year-old. And I think there was outrage when he was sentenced to 3 years, and people wanted him to be hanged as well. And he's now actually out of the Young Offender Institute that he was in. So I think, you know, we have to actually, as, you know, civilized societies, need to be looking at rehabilitation. Even after what the judge called in this case, you know, exceptional depravity and extreme brutality is how he described this particular case, which is what it was. You know, I think, you know, watching a film like this, you know, I think all of us feel raped, and over, I mean, I've watched this film twice, and you're just left absolutely, you know, kind of silenced. You know, you're outraged but silenced and stunned by this. And it takes, you know, some time, I think, to actually recover from that. So I think, you know, I kind of like the way Deepa Mehta has actually brought out some of these things. So I kind of observed that as well between Janki and her boyfriend.
Right, we have time for just one last question, and please go ahead.
I appreciate the forum to express concern about the whole issue. And someone mentioned the other day on a television question time that men should not say anything in terms of criticism about sexual violence, because mostly they're perpetrators.
I'm not sure if your microphone's working, is it?
I suppose there's three things I wanted to bring up that didn't seem to get mentioned. One was alcohol and its role in this scenario. The second one is the crowds of male. When male get together, I was brought up in Liverpool, where there are two football teams, and I didn't like football, and I never have done, and I will not ever go to a match. But it's that crowd culture which can, you know, manifest in two or three. You know it when you're on the street and it's at night and people have been drinking. There is violence in the air, or there is potential in the air. And the other thing is that was mentioned was the role of the media. Recently, a friend had to withdraw her daughter from a boarding school, a single-gender boarding school, where she found that because her daughter wasn't given a phone, she was almost alienated by those in her dorm. Not deliberately, but by fact. And then discovered that there was a lot of self-abuse within that dorm and within this, you know, prestigious school. And so it throws up the question, what are we allowing our children particularly to see with these handheld devices? I mean, there's a Jewish saying, I think, that having a television is like having a sewer running through your room. And to some extent, I have to agree with it. In these cases, we allow our children to control something which is potentially so damaging. I don't know where this is going in terms of questions,
right.
But just comments.
Children of the digital age. Amit, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I have a 13-year-old daughter, and she's a child of the digital age, and she fights with me in terms of human rights if I take her phone away. That having been said, I think it's important to affirm that today we live in a time where people can make media. That people, in a way that's unprecedented, that we live in a time of democratizing media. I think we should say that. That having been said, we also live in a time of new habits forming in media that are new media. These habituations, to me, are the issue. Not necessarily pornography or not necessarily the sewer running through, because, all media is kinds of sewers. And, Bollywood is a kind of sewer. But to me, it's the kind of habituations, the set of habits, the whole kind of culture that goes along with either making it okay, not commenting on it, not appreciating it critically, and certainly not creating a space in which people can respond critically. I do work a lot on exhibition cultures in India. So I look at, I engage and participate in people literally dancing in the aisles during cinema, right? So in India, there's a very strong tradition of speaking to the screen and actually intervening in media. That to me is a habit that we should actually celebrate, because that's an active engagement with what is otherwise precisely what you're saying, a kind of sewer stream that makes you want to just sit in your place in a closed and dark room, right? That's, to me, one of the important contributions of Indian exhibition culture, that doesn't have to be the destiny of media. We can have an activist, we can have an active relationship to media, and I think that's something that I would certainly say that's part of Indian culture and part of Indian history.
Thanks.
With the demise of the single-screen talkie, that happens less and less, because of course you have securitized multiplexes, because all the multiplexes are in malls. So that happens less and less. And so we're talking about a globalized media scape that is more and more secured and allows them a very, very passive form of habituation to develop.
Right, I'm afraid we have to end on that note. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks to our panel.
Thank you very much.